Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of this course. So, the chapter you're reading for this week does a wonderful job of tying together the themes that we've been looking at so far and nicely sets us up to jump into the social and political dynamics of America in the 20th century next week. So, there's a lot to follow in this chapter, but hopefully, you can distill some common themes from it. You also might find something that you'd like to look into for more depth with the paper, a proposal of which I want by the end of next week. And I want to remind you that the assignment and special PowerPoint on paper writing are also posted on Vanco Hall. So Lepore starts this chapter. Let's see if I can. I'm trying to use two computers to make this go a little more smoothly. Oh, I disappeared. Well, I guess you don't need me. So Lepore starts the chapter with a discussion of citizenship. I think her discussion makes a bit more sense if you consider it within a transnational framework and also consider the various meanings of the term nation. So I ask you to do this in your discussion board post for this week as well. And I want to go into a bit more depth now in a way that I hope will tie together some of the themes we dealt with in the first 4 weeks of this course. It's a little bit lengthy, but I hope this helps you to make sense of something that's incredibly important to American history and just about everyone else's history. So, in the United States, when we say nation in popular usage, we're usually referring to the country. In the rest of the world, that's not how they use the word nation. Nation refers to an ethnicity. So that's why in much of the world the term nationalism reminds people of the kind of ethnic superiority complexes that have led to terrible acts of intolerance in very recent memory, ongoing in some parts of the world. Whereas in the United States, people who proudly call themselves nationalists will sometimes say that that just means that they love their country. So I'm describing ideal types, of course. The reality of the United States is a bit more muddied, as you see in our readings this week. So let me try to illustrate a non-US definition of nation with an example that I hope will strike some of you as really weird. So up until the year 2000, you were only eligible for German citizenship if the West German, then Unified German government considered you to have German heritage, or what they sometimes called blood. So this meant that someone claiming German descent from, say, Russia could become a citizen, even though they had never lived in Germany before and didn't know anything about how the country worked. But a person whose grandparents were from Turkey, even though they themselves and maybe even their parents had lived their entire lives in Germany, was still ineligible for full citizenship. There were people in the 1990s who didn't even speak Turkish, who were 100% German in their identities and the way they saw themselves, yet ineligible for full citizenship because of the way the German state defined citizenship. In the United States, by contrast, that's weird. You know, anyone born in this country is automatically a citizen, and we have a long history of welcoming immigrants, just as we have a long history of sort of waffling between welcoming and restricting immigration based on the fickleness of public opinion at any given time. But we tend to recognize that an ethnic component to citizenship, for the most part, is a bit silly. So, on one level, to be German before 2000, the year 2000, meant you had to descend from people who culturally and linguistically identified with Germanness. The borders of those identities can be difficult to police and determine. In the United States, by contrast, to belong to the US nation, you simply had to be a citizen, and in our ideal typical construction, that's not limited by ethnicity. As you know, oops, hey, look at that, my face is back. So that's not limited by ethnicity, but as you know, in our history, we've often tried to limit immigration by ethnicity, barring Asian immigration in its entirety for almost 100 years, and denying Black people full citizenship rights from the period of the Dred Scott decision, when it was legally restricted, all the way until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 sort of made it de facto possible for Black people to have rights in all parts of the United States, civil rights. So, of course, to this day, anytime someone's vote or right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness is limited by an official act, their rights as citizens are denied as well. And very often we know that that's not just. So, I want to contextualize some of the debates on limiting citizenship and nationhood in the United States. That term nationalism comes from the period of the French Revolution, when Napoleon encouraged ethnic groups across Europe to join his revolution and establish their own national republics allied with France. He sought to encourage Slovene and Croatian speakers in the Habsburg Empire, for example, to feel nationalism. He argued that they would have better democratic rights if they established their own, what was called the Illyrian Republic, in opposition to the German speaking Habsburgs. He also encouraged Poles to do the same, to form the Duchy of Warsaw. In the early 19th century, thinkers across Europe, notably Germans, Slavs, and Italians, began to think that they could only secure the benefits of liberty and a constitution if they established their own nation states, or countries where the ethnicity of the population matched the name of the country. The French had already done this when, during their revolution, they appealed to French nationalism by setting up a uniform language policing center, for example, called the Académie Française, and that tried to standardize the various dialects of French, encouraging. They also encouraged symbols of patriotism in this period and emphasized that all men were now citizens, not subjects. So they were people who could act, not be acted upon. So shortly thereafter, Serbs, Romanians, Greeks would rebel against the Ottoman Empire for the sake of establishing their own nation states, and this would, within a decade, spread around the entire world. So the U.S. Revolutionary War, though, happened before all of these events. In the 1790s, when French people were talking about the nation as if it was an ethnic construct of all French people, the Federalist political party in the United States talked about it as if it was the federal government. So that's really key to where this distinction in terms comes about. So the national program of Henry Clay by the 1820s, for example, was meant to unify the interests of all the states in a way that he hoped would convince northern states and southern states that they had common interests despite their disagreements over slavery. For some early American patriots, there was a desire to embrace revolutionary symbols of American nationalism. Noah Webster, for example, he wrote a dictionary with a few minor spelling modifications from common British usages of English. This is why American spelling is only slightly less ridiculous than British spellings of the English language. He didn't go very far, though. Our spelling is still really screwed up. So, despite the lack of an ethnic component to this definition of nation, it was still clear that many Americans defined their identity as white, Anglo Saxon, and Protestant. And by defining their identity as this, they imagined that those who didn't have this identity didn't belong in America. So, this is why early groups of Irish immigrants were often opposed for not quite fitting into the American definition of self, despite the fact that this wasn't a legal definition. Irish immigrants eventually assimilated, and today, of course, the best St. Patrick's Day parties are here in the United States, not in Ireland. That's a contentious opinion. You're welcome to dispute it. So, in the middle of the 1880s, though, or sorry, in the middle of the 1800s, though, most ethnic groups in the world that were imagining what a nation state should be didn't have their own political entities to call their own. We were different. We had a country. It was called the United States of America. We even fought to preserve it in the Civil War. So Germans, for instance, they lived in a hodgepodge of different microstates, as did Italians, Arabs, Persians, and Slavs were primarily ruled over by various empires, while many in Africa and Asia were only just beginning to be ruled over by European imperialists. Uh, in much of Latin America at this time, class differences between privileged descendants of Europeans and those of mixed indigenous and European ancestry limited the establishment of strong national identities, though events like the Mexican American War and establishment of the Republic under Benito Juarez made Mexico somewhat of an exception to that rule. So, the reason I'm telling you all this is just to emphasize that the United States wasn't necessarily an exception to the definition of nation that people around the world were imagining at the time. It was an interesting example of something worth a degree of emulation. Americans had a strong, robust economy and were expanding across an entire continent. That was inspiring, especially to little tiny states in Europe or declining states in the Middle East. The United States also had a constitution and a system of government that was the envy of people yearning for democratic institutions around the world. So, as the French began to consolidate their control over colonial Algeria after 1848, they looked to the examples of settlers in the American West as a way to enhance their empire. They even tried to grow cotton to have their own source of the commodity that was coming from the American South. When Germans unified in 1870, Bismarck almost immediately began trying to set up German colonies in Africa, again to build a robust, strong German nation modeled in part on the United States of America. So, as nationalism and weird racial theories began to go back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, many began to imagine, or at least yearn for, a white, Anglo Saxon, Protestant, usually American identity for men. So, the fact that this has never been the sole identity of Americans caused so many of the problems that you read about in this week's readings. So, we've already dealt with, let me try and switch slides now. Oh, there goes my face again. All right. Um, So we've already dealt with the dash promises of Reconstruction and limitations on immigration in previous weeks. An interesting discussion in this week's readings was of the various reactions to the growth of capital in the latter quarter of the 19th century. You had the strange emergence of the notion of corporate personhood, ironically using an amendment, the 14th Amendment, that was designed to expand citizenship to include former slaves and all people born in the United States. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and only a little more than a decade later, lawyers for railroads used this amendment to argue that levying taxes on railroads for improvements to their land violated their rights as persons under the law. That is, the rights of the railroad corporations as persons, it's a legal fiction, which allows people who form corporations to avoid liability for business decisions and instead shift the liability to the corporate entity itself. They, of course, take major dividends from the corporation all the time to pay themselves as actual humans. So it was these kinds of legal fictions at the behest of these corporate overlords growing wealthy over the exploitation of the West that kindled the anger of populists, who in many cases, especially after the global depression of 1873, were growing poor in the West. Lepore deals with two people in particular who resisted the power of unchecked capitalism in quite a bit of detail. Mary E. Lease, who's pictured here, and William Jennings Bryan, who was pictured on my first slide. So Lease was an activist who became a prominent lecturer on behalf of the Populist Party. Lease helped to mold a sort of anti-capitalist rhetoric that was in many ways uniquely American. While much of the world's opposition to capitalism was coalescing at this time around the ideas of Karl Marx and the socialists, Americans in the West were using a unique blend of religiosity, Republican, meaning the idea of rugged individualism prominent in the early Republican grit, and a desire to be left alone, either by big bankers or by big government. So, strands of this populism today have been co opted by both parties. Neither Republicans nor Democrats will say to people that they're campaigning uh, that they want to work at the behest of Wall Street. You can't get elected saying that, but it's also hard to get elected without the interests of big money at heart either. So socialism would later gain appeal in the industrial and mining areas of America, but populism was the language of the Western farmers seeking protection from the whims of global commodity markets. Another speaker who had an illustrious political career was William Jennings Bryan. My great grandpa on my mom's side was a missionary in Wisconsin in the year 1899. And I actually have an excerpt from his journal where he writes about attending one of Bryan's speeches. He wrote that his words were amazing, but he didn't know what to think about his policies. So before and after his stint as a missionary, my great grandpa was a very religious farmer, precisely the demographic to which Bryan was appealing. Bryan used American evangelical Christian themes mixed with a desire to appeal to a more essentialized version of farmers as good, honest people of the soil who needed protection from Eastern bankers and capitalists. And they did. So, the message worked. So, one thing the populists fought hard for was to mint silver in order to increase available currency, arguing that some inflation would allow for the circulation of capital that would stimulate their economies and allow them to get out of debt. American populism anticipated and was informed by some of the themes of popular nationalism in Europe as well. So, like the Russian Black Hand or the Sokol movement in Slavic lands or the Turnvater movement in Germany, these are all goofy 19th century nationalist slash populist movements in Europe. American populists were also notoriously anti Semitic, anti immigrant, anti black. They wanted protection from capitalism, but typically only for white Christian Americans. So, in many 19th century imaginations, Jewish people in particular were often conflated with capitalists and bankers. You see a reawakening of these stereotypes and tropes with the QAnon conspiracy theories that are gaining a weird amount of prominence right now. But their darker side became more pronounced among American populists after the global depression of 1873, which hit the commodity based economies and producers in the American West particularly hard. Hey, my face is back. So, another of the limitations to citizenship that Lepore explores is women's rights. In 1848, American women held a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, where they drafted a declaration of sentiments outlining all of the consequences of a lack of political rights on the lives of women, their families, and society as a whole. Uh, Pictured here, you see, well, my face down there, but this is the SUNY Delhi History Club visiting the Seneca Falls Convention National Park site in 2017. If things go back to normal again and we're all on campus, why, I would invite you to join the history club. We might go there again this spring. So, uh, in 1848, one of the things their resolutions uh, focus on was that all of their problems could be better addressed if they focused their energies on just one thing: getting the right to vote. Everything could be fixed through the political process if they could just take part in that process. So Lepore doesn't start there, though. She covers that convention in previous chapters, but interestingly, with the 15th Amendment, which was intended to guarantee voting rights to former slaves, that's where she starts. So many hoped that the 15th Amendment would include provisions for Chinese immigrants and women, which it did not explicitly. This uh, this caused a split in the American Equal Rights Association into the Women's Suffrage Association that didn't support the amendment and the American Women's Suffrage Association, which reasoned that since it didn't actually forbid women from voting, they could still support it because it left hope that, that American women could gain the right to vote someday. And certainly, in many Western territories and states, they were allowing women the right to vote in the latter half of the 19th century. In part, this was a ploy to be able to increase the number of voters so that they could reach the minimum threshold of voters required to achieve statehood. But the idea that women deserved to be considered citizens with voting rights would take decades more to achieve. So, the final bit of her chapter that I really appreciate, how do I get there? Is this discussion on, what I've titled in this slide, what is truth? Um, and I really appreciated how she discussed the professionalization of the social sciences and media. The In particular, in the latter half of the 19th century, this was happening all over the world, not just in the United States. The university system of Germany after 1870 had a huge impact on the rest of the world. Germans sought to apply the scientific method to all areas of social practice. Theodor Ranke helped to create the modern ethic of objectivity in history writing, and I love that she gives a shout out to that guy. That to this day defines how we write history. When someone publishes something in an academic press, it needs to consider all possible sides to an issue, be factual, importantly, not lie, and be peer reviewed by other experts in whatever field it's being published in. That notion of objectivity became desirable in the media too, and after so called yellow journalism or sensational nonsense led Americans into the Spanish American War, there were calls to have better standards of truth in journalism as well. So, all right, that is my presentation for week 5. I've got some bonus questions below. I hope you love this chapter as much as I did. Here are the bonus questions. You can pause on these if you need to. Good luck, and please reach out to me if you'd like to discuss ideas for your paper. And remember that I want a proposal for your first paper by the end of next week. Good luck, and I hope to hear from you.